Thank you for joining us again. I want to thank you for being part of our Safer at Home series, and thanks for being part of it tonight. Um, um, and so, want to make sure that point out a couple of things before we get started. These talks are brought to you by Cape Cod 5, by First Citizens Federal Credit Union, by Martha's Vineyard Savings. We also want to make sure that you know that all the books that we offer are sold at 8 Cousins Booksellers, so we hope you participate in going there. If you've got a question, we want to use the chat feature down below, so type that in. Our guest tonight is probably no stranger to you. He's a Cape guy. He used to work for the Boston Globe. He's been to Falmouth when talking about his last book about Bobby Kennedy, a liberal icon. You also may remember when we had Eileen McNamara a couple of years ago. Larry was the moderator. So yes, even though he's not far from Falmouth, COVID-19 makes sure he's still safer at home. So just like the rest of us. So want to thank you for joining us tonight, and would you all welcome Larry Tye.
So thank you. What I would like to do is start out by telling you a few things about the Joe McCarthy book before we visit the McCarthy story itself. And anytime that you hear an author talk about a book that has had as many other books written about a subject as Joe McCarthy has had, you ought to ask yourself one simple question, which is, why did the world need the 101st book on Joe McCarthy and the Red Scare? And the answer is it may not have, but A, I wanted to write it, and B, I had access, I didn't know this going into it, but I had access to materials that biographers had been waiting for 70 years. And I want to just take a minute and tell you about 3 separate caches of materials that I had the first look at. One was 9,000 pages of transcripts of Joe McCarthy's closed-door hearings. And if you know anything about Joe McCarthy, you may know that he held some very famous public hearings. The most famous of them was the so-called Army McCarthy set of hearings. Arguably the most famous hearings ever held by any congressional committee up until that time. But it turns out that 2/3 of the sessions that McCarthy held were behind closed doors. He kicked out the press, he kicked out the public, and he invited only people that he wanted to be there. And there were these hearing transcripts were under lock and key for half a century. And a few years ago, they were made public, and nobody has ever really taken a deep dive into those 9,000 pages of transcripts. And it was these transcripts that led a friend of mine who was the official historian of the US Senate and the guy who curated and released these transcripts to be whispering in my ear for the last 4 years, saying, you've got to write a biography on Joe McCarthy. These transcripts are really extraordinary. And what they were was a look at Joe McCarthy unhinged, a look at what he was like when he thought nobody was looking then and nobody would ever really be able to look. And any sense of acknowledging any rights that the accused had went out the door with the press and the public, and any sense that that people were innocent until proven guilty went out the door. And there was another strange thing that I saw when I was looking through these transcripts, which was that Joe McCarthy's demeanor in the morning sessions when he was stone cold sober, was very different than his demeanor in the afternoon and the evening sessions. And I think that was because his typical lunch was a hamburger, a slice of raw onion, and a whole lot of whiskey to wash it down. And in the afternoon, he showed the signs of that whiskey. His temper was a whole lot shorter. If you were a witness and you were standing up to Joe McCarthy, you didn't want to try to do that in the afternoon or the evening when he had no patience at all. So one set of documents I had to look at was these transcripts, 9,000 pages, as I say. A second set, which was sort of the holy grail of the Joe McCarthy material, were all the papers, tens of thousands of pages of papers that his widow donated to his alma mater, Marquette University, when shortly after he died, 60 years ago. She donated these papers, his personal and professional files, with the provision that they would become public when either of two things happened. One was when their infant daughter died, and she is a healthy 62-year-old, and she's going to outlive me. And she's been saying for the last 60 years, when anybody came and asked her to look at those papers, she's been saying no. And the other was when she decided if she would decide to say yes. So she's been saying no for 60 years, and she said no to me more different times than I can count. But one day, a week after I told my publisher and my wife that I had no chance of getting access to those papers, exactly a week later, I got an email from the chief archivist at Marquette saying, I'm shocked and you will be shocked to find out that the family has said you can look at those papers. And they gave me a very a very strange kind of permission. The permission was I could look at them, but the day that I stopped looking, the papers went back under lock and key. And what those papers showed was everything from Joe McCarthy's love letters to his someday wife, the woman who would become his wife. They showed his real-time personal handwritten diaries when he was a soldier during World War II in the South Pacific. And they showed one document after another with a big stamp in red saying top secret, that the FBI, the CIA, and all kinds of other agencies had leaked to Joe McCarthy over the years. So stash number one, 9,000 pages of transcripts of closed door hearings. Stash number two, all of his personal and professional papers. And there was one last set of documents, the ones I was most convinced I was never going to see. And one morning, early one morning, when my wife and I were out for a walk from our house in Katuitt with our dog in the early morning, we saw an enormous brown box at the head of our driveway. And my wife said, we've got to stop and see what that is. It could rain and those could be important documents and they could get wet. And I said, no, let's take a long and relaxed walk. The documents are still going to be there. The box is still going to be there. When we got back, I opened it up, and it turned out those were the documents I had been asking for 2 years from the military. They were all of McCarthy's medical records from Bethesda Naval Hospital, and they showed the addictions that he had, what he truly died of, which wasn't what the coroner and the press told us at the time. So again, 3 stashes, transcripts, personal professional papers, and all of his most intimate medical records. And the bottom line is, given all those documents, whether or not I wrote a good book, I'm too close to say, but if I couldn't write a good and a different book than anything that had been out there on Joe McCarthy, given all the papers I was given access to, then shame on me. So what I want to do now is ask you to indulge me. I'm going to keep my remarks relatively brief, and I would much rather answer your questions than go on via Zoom. And it's very difficult to watch a speaker just a talking head on Zoom. But I want you to join me in a trip to 3 milestone moments in Joe McCarthy's life. And I'd like us to start at moment number 1, which is when he was a soldier fighting in the South Pacific. And I mentioned that I was given access to his files that included his real-time World War II handwritten diaries. And Joe McCarthy, when he went off to fight in the South Pacific, told the world that he was a hero. And he said he actually called himself in his first campaign for Senate, Tail Gunner Joe. He said, I was off fighting in these plains over these South Pacific islands, and I was a heroic tail gunner coming under enemy fire, shooting at and shooting down enemy planes. And the press at the time had watched Joe McCarthy do so much embellishing of his records that they said they started doing a little bit of digging of their own. And they said, look, Joe, you may say you're a tail gunner, but in fact, we know that your real assignment in the South Pacific Island was as a land-based intelligence officer. Now, being on the island at all means that you're under some risk, but the safest job on that island for a U.S. Marine like you was being on the ground, not up there in the air where there were these battles between Japanese and American planes. And the press basically concluded that the notion of him as a tail gunner was not just an embellishment, but a joke. And NBC television actually did an hour-long documentary that they called Tail Gunner Joe. And they called it Tail Gunner Joe, caricaturing this guy, saying, this is what kind of a liar he is. He'll even go as far as lying about what he did when people were being killed on that island in the South Pacific, and he's telling us he did something that he didn't do. Well, it turns out that his real-time diaries record in stunning detail his missions flying in planes, often as a tail gunner. His official assignment was on the ground as a land-based intelligence officer, but in fact, he was volunteering for missions in a plane under enemy fire. And it wasn't just his rendering of this that made clear that he was a hero during the war. It was letters in those files from all of his squad mates in the South Pacific saying, we took Joe McCarthy up on our plane and we knew that he was volunteering for this mission, these missions that he didn't have to be doing, and that all the medals he was given from the Marines for that service were not a matter of politics, they were a matter of heroism. So in the beginning, we have Joe McCarthy, the embellisher, if not the outright liar, actually telling the truth. But it goes to show that if you lie often enough, on the rare occasions where you are telling the truth, nobody will believe you. So this is one of the counterintuitive things that I found in my research, that Joe McCarthy, in the very most important formative chapter of his career and life in the US military during World War II, was counterintuitively telling us the truth when we thought he was lying. So moment number one is Joe McCarthy in the South Pacific. Moment number two that I would ask you to join me at is Joe McCarthy on the night where McCarthyism and McCarthy's crusade against communism was born. And that was on February 9, 1950. We've moved ahead from the mid-1940s and his wartime service to February 1950, when he is a US Senator from Wisconsin. And on that night, you may recognize that date. That date of February 9th is an important date in a Republican's political calendar. It is a celebration of Abraham Lincoln's birthday. And at a dinner called the Lincoln Day Dinner, Republicans all across America get together. And they get together partly to raise their morale, but more importantly, they get together to raise money and to really gin up their whole election apparatus. And if you're a prominent senator or a president or a vice president, you get invited to deliver the Lincoln Day dinner in places that matter. And that might be in Boston or New York, in Chicago or Washington. When you're Joe McCarthy, a backbench senator that most of America, if they've ever heard of him at all, assumes is going to become a one-term senator, this guy who's done essentially nothing, you get invited to where Joe McCarthy got invited in 1950. And it was a place that his staff referred to as Wheeling, West by God, Virginia. And he's invited to the middle of nowhere to give the Lincoln Day dinner. And he shows up that night with an enormous briefcase. And in the briefcase are two speeches. And he doesn't decide until the last minute which one to give. The first speech in the briefcase is a snoozer of a speech on national housing policy. And had he given that speech that night, we wouldn't be here 70 years later talking about Joe McCarthy, because he would have become that one-term senator that I mentioned. But instead, he reaches deeper into his briefcase and he pulls out a sheaf of papers and he holds them up in his hand and he says, I have here in my hand a list of 205 spies at the State Department. They are people who are threatening our government. They're people that Harry Truman, the president, should have known about and should have rooted out of his State Department. And I want you to remember, if you will, what that moment was like in 1950 in America. It was a time when we had just watched nationalist China turn into red China. We had just watched the atomic spies, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, be arrested, tried, and convicted of leaking atomic secrets to the Soviets. It was a moment, and unless you're old enough, you won't believe me when I tell you this last moment, it was just about the time we were teaching our school children that in the event of an attack, an atomic attack by the Soviets, what they should do is what was called duck and cover. Put your hands over your head, duck under your desk, and you'd be okay if there were an atomic attack. It was at a moment of ultimate fear in America of the Soviet Empire that Joe McCarthy was there in Wheeling, West Virginia, telling us that he had a list of more than 200 spies in our very own State Department. Now, what he had in his hand that night, we will never know. It might have been a grocery list. It might have been a recycled list of supposed spies that had been uncovered years before, but we know it was not an active list of 205 spies in the State Department. And we know that because over time, McCarthy was called before the Senate to explain what he had had in his hand. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that within 2 days, Joe McCarthy was on page 1 of every newspaper in America. And his crusade against communism was born, and the movement that we would come to know as McCarthyism was born, a movement that was synonymous with the notion of reckless accusation, like Joe McCarthy was making that day in Wheeling, West Virginia. Joe McCarthy's crusade was off and running, and he never looked back. So moment number 1, again, was South Pacific in the mid-40s. Moment number 2 was Joe McCarthy and the birth of his movement in 1950. Moment number 3 that I would love you to join me with is in 1954, the beginning of 1954. And this is when the whole McCarthyism movement and his crusade has come to its seemingly high moment. At the end of 1953, McCarthy, after having accused the State Department of harboring spies, the White House, the government printing office, the Voice of America, agency after agency, at the end of 1953, Joe McCarthy took on his most powerful adversary, the U.S. Armed Services. And he said that a particular base, an Army base in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, which was the centerpiece of the command and control structure for all the armed services. It was where the so-called Army Signal Corps had its major operation. And Joe McCarthy said that operation was riddled with communist moles. And he said it in a way that was dramatic enough, and he got enough press attention that the Army started paying attention. The Secretary of the Army, a guy from Massachusetts named Robert Stevens, said, "You show us the spies, and we will suspend them and try them and root them out." And it looked like McCarthy had hit a gold mine in taking on the Army and showing that there were spies there. But there was a problem. The Army, over time, started realizing that these weren't really spies and the people they were suspending were innocent. They also realized that Joe McCarthy was asking special treatment for a young aide of his named G. David Shine, an associate of a more famous aide named Roy Cohn. David Shine had been drafted by the Army. He was serving as a private at a base in New York, and Joe McCarthy was asking for all kinds of special treatment. So on the one hand, McCarthy's going after the Army and accusing it of harboring communists. On the other hand, he's asking for special treatment. And finally, the Army started pushing back. And as the Army's leveling countercharges and McCarthy keeps leveling more charges, his fellow senators say enough is enough. We've got to sort this all out. So they call a special set of hearings, the famous Army McCarthy hearings. At the beginning of those hearings, at the beginning of 1954, Joe McCarthy's popularity, according to the Gallup poll, was at a full 50%. 1 in every 2 Americans thought that this guy was doing a great job. And to give you a sense of what it meant at that moment to have a 50% popularity rating, the only public figure in America more popular than Joe McCarthy was our war hero president, Dwight Eisenhower. So McCarthy goes into those hearings about as popular as you could get. But by the midpoint of those hearings, a famous Boston lawyer stands up after McCarthy accuses this lawyer, this Boston lawyer who is representing the Army. McCarthy says that this lawyer's young associate was affiliated with a communist front group. And that was too much for Joe Welch, the Boston lawyer. And he stands up and he says to McCarthy, pointing a finger, he says, "Senator, have you no sense of decency? At long last, have you no sense of decency?" And those may have been the most famous words ever uttered by an American lawyer anywhere. And most people who remember those hearings think that that was the ultimate turning point and think this was spontaneous outrage by Joe Welch against this outrageous character, Joe McCarthy. We now know, and as I outline in the book, that Joe Welch had had those lines in his pocket for the whole course of the hearings. Welch was almost as good an actor as he was a lawyer. Welch knew that McCarthy would do something going over the edge and doing something warranting his questioning McCarthy's decency. So looking like it was spontaneous, but in fact in a planned way, he came out and asked a question that was a logical question, but the real drama of that question was not Welch's asking whether McCarthy had any decency. The drama was that by that moment, midway into the hearings, Joe McCarthy, who had started the hearings looking like this great champion of the little guy, by that point, midway through, looked more like the town bully. And all of America, the tens of millions of Americans who were tuning in every night to these hearings, wanted to, I think, ask the same question. And that's why Welch's words carried such weight. All of America was asking, Have you no sense of decency, Senator? By the end of the hearings, McCarthy's Gallup poll favorability rating had gone from the 50% it was at the start to 34% at the end. And that was all his fellow senators had to see to develop a bit of backbone. They stood up to McCarthy, and by December of 1954, by the end of the year that started out with the hearings, the Senate censured him. It was only the sixth time in American history that the senators had censured one of their own. Essentially, from that moment at the end of 1954 till McCarthy's death in 1957, he was essentially politically dead. So number one again was in the Marines in World War II. 1950 is when the crusade began. 1954 is when the crusade ended. And the last moment I want to take you to is 1957 when Joe McCarthy died. And I want to tell you two things about what happened in 1957. One is, as I say, Joe McCarthy died. And we now know, based on these medical records from Bethesda Naval Hospital, that he did not die of the acute hepatitis that the coroner told us and that reporters reported on in 1957. He in fact died of alcoholism. He started drinking himself to death at the time of his censure at the end of 1954. He had always been a drinker, but from 54 to 57, he was drinking the equivalent of a fifth of whiskey a day. By 1957, he had had repeatedly the DTs, delirium tremens, and in the end, what he died of was very clearly the effects of alcohol poisoning. But the real story that I want to tell you about his death is that Joe McCarthy, the man, died in 1957, but McCarthyism, the movement named after him, I think is alive and well in America today. And the story that I started telling in 2016, at the end of 2016, that looked like it might be a story of ancient American history, I think is proving every day to be the story of what is going on in our political world today. And I didn't set out to write a partisan book. I set out to write a biography of Joe McCarthy and of other demagogues that were inspired by him in American history. But one cannot ignore the story that is going on today. And you may recognize the name Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was Joe McCarthy's chief of staff and chief legal counsel, starting out in 1953 when McCarthy took over the powerful Senate subcommittee on investigations. He brought in this brilliant, arrogant lawyer from New York to run the show, Roy Cohn. That was in 1953. In the mid-1980s, 30 years later, the same Roy Cohn, no longer young, but still brilliant and still arrogant, was brought in by two New York real estate guys, a man named Fred Trump and his son, the young Donald Trump, to tutor Donald Trump in this new cutthroat world of New York real estate that Trump was getting involved in. His father knew he needed some tutelage. He figured the ultimate hardball politician, Roy Cohn, the ultimate New York fixer, was the perfect guy to tutor him. And what Roy Cohn really did was pass on to Donald Trump Joe McCarthy's playbook. And that was a playbook. I want to just give you a couple instances of what I see as the connection from what Demagogue Joe McCarthy was doing in the 1950s to what Demagogue Donald Trump is doing in the 2000s. And that is that in lieu of solutions, Demagogues like these two and others throughout American history point fingers. When they're attacked, demagogues aim a wrecking ball at their assailants. When one charge against a manufactured enemy is exposed as hollow, demagogues the next day lob a fresh bombshell. And bullies throughout American history have been brilliant at using the press as their megaphone, charming reporters, intimidating reporters, whatever it takes. And then when the news is bad, they turn around and blame the newsmen and the newswomen. And I think the parallels are such that even though I only mention the name Donald Trump in the preface and in the epilogue to my book, one could argue every page reading about Joe McCarthy is as much the story of today as it was the story of the 1950s. So I think if I haven't offended everybody who is tuning in right now, I would love to turn to Mark and see whether there are any questions that anybody would like to ask or anything you'd like to say as a counterpoint to what I've said.
I'm just the host. I'm not going to counterpoint anything.
Okay.
In following up on what you had said about with Joseph Welch, I always found the quote that Welch had delivered, even prefaced that, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. And I think that was one that always pointed out. By the way, if you got a question for Mr. Ty, use the chat feature. We'll use that. Behind you is a copy of a book that you wrote about Bobby Kennedy. And tell us how Bobby Kennedy got involved with Joe McCarthy, because he was right there with them.
Yes. So I would love to tell you about Bobby Kennedy, because it was in fact Bobby's widow, Ethel Kennedy, who got me interested in McCarthy in the first place. And I did 2 long interviews with Ethel for the Bobby book, and she said something about Joe McCarthy that always stuck in my mind. First, a bit of background. The Bobby Kennedy, when he was graduating from law school in 1953, in 1952, actually, the end of 1952, he needed a job. And his father, Papa Joe Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy clan, had given enough money over the years to Joe McCarthy, and they had enough of a friendship that when Bobby needed a job, all that Papa Joe Kennedy had to do was call Joe McCarthy on the phone and say, "My son would love to work for you." And Joe McCarthy, knowing the kind of donations he had gotten, but also knowing a bit about Bobby, said, "Sure, send him on down." And he thought for a while about making Bobby his chief of staff before he brought in Roy Cohn, and ended up deciding Bobby should be the number 2 in that office. Bobby had no real track record like Roy Cohn did. And so Bobby Kennedy went to work for Joe McCarthy at the start of 1953. He stayed for 5.5 months, and he stayed Joe McCarthy's friend for the rest of McCarthy's life. He thought that Joe McCarthy was doing a great job. He thought he was the only person in Washington who had the courage to really stand up to the communists and take on the communist threat. And what Ethel said to me was that Joe McCarthy might be a monster to much of America, but to Bobby and me, he was just plain good fun. Now, I've heard a lot of adjectives applied to Joe McCarthy, but the idea of just plain good fun was so shocking to me that I thought there's got to be another side to this McCarthy character that I don't understand. And I saw that, in fact, there was, that he was in many ways an exceedingly charming guy. He is the kind of guy that I would love to have gone out for a beer with and to done a very long interview with. He was the kind of guy who, after grilling a witness for an entire morning and afternoon, he thought that this was all part of a game and that everybody understood the rules. and he would invite those witnesses out to have a drink with him or have dinner with him that night. So McCarthy was a guy who had a charming enough side that the state of Wisconsin overwhelmingly elected him, then reelected him, and that half of Americans thought he was a great guy, and that he charmed Bobby and Ethel Kennedy, Joe Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, and two of Bobby and Jack's sisters who dated Joe McCarthy, and he tried to date the third and the youngest of them, Jean.
Okay. And you mentioned Roy Cohn. There's biographies done on him that are, he's quite the character.
He is quite the
McCarthy.
character, but can I interrupt for 1 second?
Sure,
So a
go
lot
ahead.
of people say, geez, Roy Cohn was a vile character and he's the one to blame. And Bobby Kennedy conveniently never blamed Joe McCarthy for the excesses of McCarthyism. He blamed Roy Cohn. And Bobby had a great quote. He said, Roy Cohn took Joe McCarthy up a very large mountain in a toboggan, and they headed down with no brakes. And he said that it was an incredibly exciting ride for Roy Cohn and Joe McCarthy, but that it was inevitable that they were going to crash at the bottom. Now, I think blaming Roy Cohn that Joe McCarthy was the adult, Joe McCarthy was the boss, and Roy Cohn may have reinforced every bad instinct in Joe McCarthy's bones, but a lot of people, from biographers to filmmakers, want to put it all on Roy Cohn, and I think that's unfair.
The question here, kind of fascinating. The McCarthy hearing and the Watergate hearing, I understand, took place in the same hearing room in Washington. What are the similarities and the differences between the two hearings?
So I think there are loads of similarities, and I think it's intriguing. One of the similarities is that some of the personalities involved. And one of the guys that before Roy Cohn accepted the job as chief counsel and chief of staff, and before Joe McCarthy had contemplated giving that job to Bobby Kennedy, there was a guy named Sirica, who he had asked to take the job and who refused to take it. And Sirica was the chief judge in the Watergate prosecutions. And it wasn't the hearings, but it was the trial that grew out of them. And we have lots of people like that turning up who cut their teeth somehow in the era of McCarthy and ended up later being part of Watergate. The central character in Watergate was obviously Richard Nixon. And one of the first people Joe McCarthy called when he gave that speech that I described to you in Wheeling, West Virginia, and he realized that he better damn well develop some evidence for spies at the State Department or anywhere else. One of the first people he called on the phone was Richard Nixon, who had been a young congressman and had cut his teeth as an anti-communist, went on to the Senate before he became vice president. McCarthy calls Nixon and says, I need some help. I need some evidence. Richard Nixon, who was never a big guy for evidence when making his charges against alleged communists, said, Joe McCarthy, he told his staff and he told his diary that Joe McCarthy is reckless and he's going to get us all in trouble someday. So you know that anybody who can make Richard Nixon look good as a truth teller was somebody to be doubted. But there were, in terms of questions of tactics and ruthlessness, lots of issues of the tactics of McCarthyism came up during the Watergate hearings as a tactic that Richard Nixon and his Watergate burglars had adopted. And I think the parallels are enormous. And it was finally Watergate where some limits were set, at least temporarily, on a lot of this kind of activity and a lot of the out of control politicians and demagoguery. So I think it's a great question, yes. And just about every famous hearing that the Senate has ever held was in that same Senate caucus room.
McCarthy was from Wisconsin, which we know, the junior senator from Wisconsin. But the mayor of Milwaukee was a socialist, was he not? And how did McCarthy deal with him?
Yes. So one of the reasons McCarthy enlisted, McCarthy was a circuit judge in Wisconsin, and he was exempt from military duty. It was felt that he was doing essential enough work as a judge that he didn't have to go off and enlist in the Marines and fight in the war. And he did. And he did in part because he saw the mayor of Wisconsin as a future political opponent. And the mayor of Wisconsin had signed up, and I can't remember whether he signed up for the Navy or the Air Force, but whatever it was, McCarthy thought he could outdo him by signing up for the Marines and come back a real war hero. And the mayor of Wisconsin ended up being killed during World War II and never coming back. But it was um, the McCarthy always had a political motive, even as he had other more legitimate motives in everything he did, including going off to war and including looking early on at who he saw as his potential opponents politically someday.
We know that the House Un-American Activities Committee ruined hundreds of lives, from Hollywood to Washington, etc. Um, how many were there people that were able to bounce back and overcome that? We know that there are people that were just ruined, but was anybody really able to um, maybe get stained with McCarthy's brush, but essentially overcome it?
Sure. So um, the hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee started a dozen years before McCarthy launched his crusade in Wheeling, West Virginia. And those are related in that they set the template for a lot of the things McCarthy would be doing. And in McCarthy's, I can't speak to what happened to the victims of the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, but I have a whole chapter called Body Count, which looks at what happened to McCarthy's targets. And we can say that a dozen of them, including 2 US senators, were pushed enough over the brink that they actually took their own lives. And if I could tell you briefly the story of one of them, who I think captures a sense of what happened to Joe McCarthy's victims. And this was a guy who worked for the Voice of America, an engineer named named Ray Kaplan. And Ray Kaplan was caught up in this McCarthy series of charges where McCarthy said that the Voice of America actually was building its radio transmitters in places where they wouldn't be the full powerful signal going to the other side of the Iron Curtain, that there was essentially sabotage going on so that the American propaganda efforts were not going to be as successful as they could be. And Ray Kaplan was petrified because he had been called by Joe McCarthy to testify. And a few days before he was due to testify, he races off from Washington to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to MIT to talk to the engineers who were the consultants who had decided in part where the radio transmitters would go. And he wanted to make sure they were going to back him up. He couldn't find them. He was petrified. He ends up walking out the main entrance, the main building at MIT on Massachusetts Avenue. A truck is coming down the street. As Ray Kaplan is stepping into the crosswalk, the truck driver slows down to let Ray Kaplan go, but Kaplan darts in front of the truck before it can stop, and the coroner rules it a clear-cut suicide. Ray Kaplan, it turned out, had left a suicide note for his widow and for his young son saying, "I have never done anything wrong, but I know that I'm not going to be able to take the pressure that's going to come on me with all these investigations." So it looked like a clear case of fear of testifying before Joe McCarthy, writes a suicide note and kills himself. But I didn't trust to just that to make the case that Joe McCarthy pushed Ray Kaplan to kill himself. I tracked down a guy half a century later who was named Jacobs, George Jacobs, who was Kaplan's supervisor at the Voice of America. And I put it to Jacobs, is it fair to have a cause and effect here? Did Joe McCarthy push Ray Kaplan into killing himself? And Jacob said something to me that was almost as memorable as what Ethel Kennedy had said. He said, if there had been no Joe McCarthy, we would still have Ray Kaplan. And your question was, did people recover? I think too many people didn't recover. People kill themselves, people watch their careers get smashed, their lives get totally turned upside down. Now, I'm sure there are some people who not just survived it, but who actually relished having survived Joe McCarthy. And I know people who used it as a badge of honor for decades after that. It was like they had a bumper sticker, I was a survivor of Joe McCarthy. But many more people, through no choice of their own and through no guilt of their own, were caught up in this McCarthy stampede. And I think that's the tragedy of Joe McCarthy.
Did McCarthy ever show privately or maybe publicly, did he ever show any remorse? Did he ever kind of have a chat with himself in the mirror and said, maybe I'm going too far?
So I kept looking for those signs of remorse, and I kept looking for signs that he acknowledged that he might have hurt people, inadvertently or not. And everywhere and every time that he was ever asked about that, he said, you name one person that I've hurt. And the reporters or whoever was asking the question would name people, and he would deny it. He was the ultimate self-justifier. And I think he, at least in starting out, was the ultimate opportunist. I don't think he believed what he was saying in Wheeling, West Virginia. He was too smart a guy, and he knew he didn't have the evidence that he said he had in his hand that night. And I think he was willing to do anything to get the public spotlight and to hold on to power once he got it. Ironically, by the end, after he had been repudiated and much of his crusade had been repudiated, one of the few people who was at the point of his death, still a true believer in Joe McCarthy, was Joe McCarthy. I think that he had repeated the charges so many times that by the end, and helped along with his alcohol, he started believing his own opportunism and his own embellishment. And by the end, Joe and his wife, Jean, were two of the truest believers that Joe McCarthy could count on.
I always found it fascinating that even after Joe passed away, and going back to an earlier question, that he had a chance to turn his back on him, that Bobby Kennedy made it a point to go to the funeral, that he felt he owed him a great debt of gratitude. I thought that spoke volumes about Bobby, frankly, and
So it did speak volumes about Bobby. A slight caveat on what Bobby did at that funeral. So Bobby's big brother, Jack, who was running for president by 1957, Jack tells Bobby, stay away from that funeral. There will be only Republicans there and you will get me into trouble. And Bobby does what younger brothers often do when big brothers give them advice like that. They listen, they pretend like they've absorbed what is being told to them, and then they go off and do what they think they ought to do, which is exactly the opposite. So Bobby ended up going to Appleton, Wisconsin for the funeral, but in deference to his brother Jack, at the funeral, Bobby sat up in the choir loft where he hoped nobody would see him. At the graveside service, all the celebrities were over here, and Bobby Kennedy was a long way away where he hoped nobody would see him. And afterwards, when the journalists who were there were taking down the names, the way they did in those days, of every celebrity who was at that graveside service, Bobby begged them not to print his name. And he said, you'll get me in trouble with my big brother Jack. So they left his name out of the stories. And I think Bobby was having it both ways. On the one hand, he was being loyal to his pal Joe McCarthy, as well as being a bit tone deaf to all the damage McCarthy had done. And on the other hand, he was being loyal to his brother Jack by making sure that only 70 years later would people realize that Bobby had been there. You're on mute, Mark?
Yeah, I had to unmute myself there.
Thank you, sorry.
Um, a question here from somebody. Can you comment on McCarthy's efforts against homosexuals, despite Roy Cohn and perhaps himself being one?
Yes. So as avidly anti-communist as Joe McCarthy was, he was anti at least three other things. One was he was anti what he called elitist, which meant if you lived on the East Coast or the West Coast, you went to a good college, you were part of Wall Street, you were part of an American establishment, that a populist, in the worst sense of the word populist like Joe McCarthy, loved to point to elitists and say, I'm an anti-elitist. So he is anti-elitist. He was, I think, anti-Semitic, and there is endless evidence for that. And he was, at least as virulently as anything else, he was anti-gay. And he went after gays in the government, saying that they were subject to blackmail. If the Soviets knew that they were gay, they could turn around and blackmail them. And it was ironic for two reasons that he did that. One is because if anybody in the government was subject to blackmail, it was Joe McCarthy, who was an alcoholic, who was a huge gambler, who had all kinds of secrets that he didn't want revealed. And if the Soviets were going after somebody that they wanted to use these secrets to get to do their bidding, they would have gone after Joe McCarthy, not some gay civil servant that Joe McCarthy was trying to root out. But the ultimate cynicism was that, as McCarthy, I think, well knew, his young aide, Roy Cohn, was gay, and Roy Cohn never had the decency to stand up and say, you know, it's okay to be gay, and we shouldn't have this kind of lavender scare, this kind of anti-gay crusade. But Roy Cohn never had the guts to talk about his being gay, even as he was dying of AIDS 70 years later.
You mentioned gambling habits. What were those?
So Joe loved to go to the racetrack, and he would often go with J. Edgar Hoover or with other prominent Americans. He loved to play poker, and he would often play all night long and sometimes lose money. He was an extraordinary bluffer. And there was no kind of gambling that Joe McCarthy didn't like to do. And he did it sometimes successfully because his bluffing worked, but other times he lost lots of money. And that was, he made a lot of money in the course of his life, and he lost even more money.
There's a pair, J. Edgar Hoover and Joseph McCarthy. That's you insert your own joke here on that one.
That is true.
What's your next project? What are you working on next?
So as my reward to myself and my publisher's reward to me, after spending 3 years with Joe McCarthy, I'm writing an incredibly upbeat book with 3 characters who I think are really wonderful figures in American history. And the book is called The Jazzmen, Jazzmen, How Duke Ellington, Satchmo Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America.
Sounds excellent. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. I want to thank everybody for taking part in this.
Can I have one self-serving last word?
By all means.
Which is, first of all, to say, Mark, you're great and the museum is great. And as they increasingly open their doors, hopefully, as it becomes safe to do that, you're all patrons of the museum, and I think they do really wonderful work. But my really self-serving word is to say, I will not be presumptuous enough to tell you to buy my book, but I will say, if you do buy my book, please buy it at the local bookstore. Was it 8? It was 8 Cousins?
8 Cousins in Falmouth.
8 Cousins.
Yep.
And if you do, and if you want, tell 8 Cousins your name and that you would like a signature plate, and they will get in touch with me. I've worked with 8 Cousins on a number of talks. They will get in touch with me, and I will mail them a signature plate to put in the book. So we couldn't have an in-person signing, but it will be the next best thing to that. So don't buy it online if you're going to buy it. Buy it locally at an independent store like the Great 8 Cousins.
I couldn't have said it better. And thank you for the kind words. Thank you everyone for joining us. Larry, thank you for taking part tonight. Stay safe, everybody. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great night, everyone. Take care. Larry, thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.